Welcome to another lecture by MedicoMedics, Physiology Chapter 7, Sensory Physiology. In this lecture, we will discuss the general organization of sensory systems, talk about vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Furthermore, we will talk about sensory integration and disorders of sensory systems, and as always, end with a summary. Now, what is sensory physiology? It is the study of how sensory systems detect stimuli and send information to the brain for processing. It allows perception of the environment and internal body states. Now, we talk about the 5 main senses. These are vision, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. We have specialized receptors for detecting these. We have mechanical, which cover touch and sound. We have chemical, which cover taste and smell. And then we have light, covering vision. Now, what is the general organization of sensory systems? So as we mentioned, we have these specialized cells or neurons that help detect stimuli. And these are special cells or nerve endings that pick up information from the environment or the body and converts it into signals that the brain can then interpret and process. We mentioned that the types of sensory receptors we have can be divided into mechanoreceptors for touch and sound, chemoreceptors, smell and taste, photoreceptors, light, and then we have thermoreceptors for temperature and nociceptors for pain. So these mechanoreceptors, for example, they detect physical forces like pressure, vibration, stretch, and or sound waves. So for example, something touching your skin or something you hear. Then we have chemoreceptors. So it's the response to chemical substances, for example, smell from your nose or taste from your tongue. The photoreceptors, we find these in the eyes. These help detect light and therefore allows us to see. Then we have the thermoreceptors, which sense temperature changes, so when something is cold or hot. And nociceptors, which pick up pain signals, usually from injury or harmful stimuli. Now, we have afferent pathways. So it is essentially the wiring to the brain. So once any of these receptors detect a stimulus, they send information through afferent or sensory nerves toward the central nervous system. Okay, so they send information through sensory nerves. We also call it afferent nerves. And this is sent towards the central nervous system, mainly the spinal cord and brain. So think of this as the body's messenger system, carrying sensory messages to be processed. We then arrive at the processing centers. So essentially the brain's control room. So after the signals, right, they've been picked up by these different receptors. They are then transmitted through sensory nerves or through our afferent pathway to our central nervous system. Now it arrives to be processed. So after these signals reach the brain, they are sent to specific areas like the thalamus, for example, which acts as a relay station. And the cerebral cortex, right? Another area where conscious perception happens. The brain then interprets these signals and helps us understand what it is we are sensing. For example, recognizing a cold object as ice. And so we then finally arrive at integration, where multiple sensory inputs combine for a cohesive perception. So it's about making sense of all of these different input. So the brain doesn't just look at one sense at a time. It often combines input from multiple senses to form a clear and complete picture of what is happening. For example, smelling and tasting food at the same time. So just to repeat, to make it clear, because this is quite high yield and knowing these different receptor types is actually quite crucial. So we had the mechanoreceptors, what it detects: pressure, vibration, stretch, or sound. A real-life example of it: feeling someone tap your shoulder or hearing a sound. Chemoreceptors, so chemicals in the air or food, is what is meant to detect. For example, smelling perfume or tasting salty chips. Photoreceptors, it detects light, so seeing sunlight or reading from a screen. Thermoreceptors, to detect changes in temperature, so noticing when the shower water is too hot or cold. And then nociceptors, or nociceptors. I keep saying nociceptors, but yeah. So it detects pain from injury or damage. For example, feeling a paper cut or a stubbed toe. Now let's begin with vision, the sense of sight. Here you can see an illustration. So in the back part of the eye, we have the retina. There are specialized cells called photoreceptors that detect light and then send signals to the brain. Now we talk about two main types. We have rods, and these work well in dim light or at night. They help us see shapes and movement, but not color. And we have cones. These work in bright light and allow us to see colors and fine details. Now, what's the pathway then? So, first, light enters the eye through the cornea and the pupil, right? So, light enters our eye. The lens, right? The lens then focuses the light onto the retina at the back of the eye. The photoreceptors in the retina detect this light and convert it into electrical signals, right? These signals then travel through the optic nerve to our visual cortex in the brain, and it is located in the occipital lobe. We talk more in depth about the anatomy and the entire process in our ophthalmology course. But for right now, it's important to get a general idea. We have light rays coming in. It is focused by the lens. Let us remove a bit here. So light comes in. It's focused here by the lens. It is detected by photoreceptors, right? It is focused here on the back on the retina. These rods and cones start working. It focuses and sends this information, converting it into correct electrical signals. And then it is able to travel through the optic nerve to our occipital lobe, essentially to our visual cortex. And why is all of this important? Because vision allows us to recognize objects, faces, places. It helps us navigate through our surroundings, interacting with people, responding to the environment, etc. Now then, let's move on to hearing, the sense of sound. So inside the inner ear, there is a spiral-shaped structure called the cochlea, or cochlea. And there are tiny specialized cells called hair cells. These hair cells are the receptors that detect sound vibrations and turn them into signals the brain can understand. So what happens? We have the external ear here, we have the inner ear here, we have the cochlea identified. So sound waves enter the ear and vibrate the eardrum, which is depicted here. Okay, sound waves come in and vibrate the eardrum. These vibrations are then transmitted through the ossicles, tiny bones. Hair cells in the cochlea then, right, convert these vibrations into electrical signals. These signals then travel via the auditory nerve to the auditory cortex. So again, sound waves enter through the outer ear, travel down the ear canal. They hit the eardrum, making it vibrate. These vibrations pass through tiny bones, 3 tiny bones actually, in the middle ear. And these are the ossicles. And we call them malleus, malleus, incus, and stapes or stapes. These are the 3 tiny bones, which we collectively called the ossicles. The vibrations then reach the cochlea, where these hair cells detect the movement. The hair cells convert these vibrations into electrical signals, and then these signals travel along the auditory nerve to the auditory cortex in the brain. And these are located in the temporal lobe. So already anatomically we are moving away from, or we are moving to a different area in the brain. Vision, we connected to the occipital lobe, right? At the back. Now we have on the side the temporal lobe, where we find the auditory cortex. And this is where sound is then made clear and to be made to be understood or interpreted. And obvious reasons for why hearing is important: it helps us communicate with by the use of language. It helps us to be aware of our surroundings, like hearing footsteps or an alarm, etc., detecting danger, etc. And continuing to smell, the sense of olfaction. So we have olfactory receptors in the nasal cavity. So inside the upper part of the nasal cavity, as depicted here, there are special cells called olfactory receptors. These receptors detect tiny airborne odor molecules when we breathe in. So what's the pathway? Odor molecules enter the nose when we sniff or breathe. These molecules bind to the olfactory receptors, right, in the nasal lining. The receptors then send signals to a brain structure called the olfactory bulb, as seen here. And it's located, as in the illustration, above, just above the nasal cavity. These signals are then passed to the olfactory cortex in the brain, where the smell is identified. This area, interestingly enough, is closely connected to parts of the brain involved in emotion and memory, like, for example, the limbic system, which is why smells can trigger strong feelings or memories. So we have already identified three different areas. We have the visual cortex, we have the olfactory cortex, and we have the auditory cortex. Now then, on to taste. So we have tiny structures called taste buds, and they are located mostly on the papillae, which is the small bumps on the tongue. These taste buds contain receptor cells that respond to different chemicals in food and drinks. And we talk about 5 basic tastes. So we have sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, or savory. And sour, for example, helps detect acidity, like in lemons. Salty detects sodium, so essential for balance. The bitter one, right? Taste bud covering the bitter is often some kind of warning for something bad. Now, each region of the tongue can detect all 5 tastes, but some areas may be slightly more sensitive to certain ones, as depicted here in this illustration. Now, what's the pathway then? So here's how taste works. We have chemicals from food dissolve in saliva and bind to the taste buds or taste receptors on the taste buds. These receptors send signals through cranial nerves, especially the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerves. These signals then reach the brain stem, then travel to the gustatory cortex in the brain, which is located in the insula and frontal operculum, and this is where the taste is fully processed. What about touch? So the sense of somatosensation. So we have receptors, mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, and nociceptors in the skin. These are important to sense pressure changes, vibration, temperature, pain, etc. And the pathway, receptors send signals through sensory nerves to the spinal cord. They are then processed in the somatosensory cortex in the brain. And it's of course important because it protects us from harm and enhances interaction with the environment. So let's review now the role of sensory integration for a unified experience. So as mentioned in the introductory page or slide, the brain combines signals from different senses to create a unified perception. For example, flavor, right? It's an integration of taste and smell. Balance combines visual, auditory, and proprioceptive input. Now, what happens when sensory systems fail? Now then, these sensory systems can become impaired. It could be due to disease, injury, aging, or neurological conditions. And these disorders can significantly affect quality of life. So if we're talking about vision disorders, right, we can have blindness, meaning partial or complete loss of vision, resulting from eye injury or a genetic cause or a disease. We have cataract, which is clouding of the eye's lens, leading to blurry vision. And it's common in older adults, but it is treatable with surgery. We have macular degeneration. So it affects the macula, which is the central part of the retina, leading to loss of central vision. We also have age-related macular degeneration, or AMD, and it's one of the leading causes of vision loss in older people. Then we have hearing. So we can have deafness, similar to blindness, is a total or partial hearing loss, maybe congenital, so from birth, or acquired from infection or loud noise exposure or aging, etc. Tinnitus, or tinnitus, depending on how you want to pronounce that, is a condition where a person hears a buzzing or a ringing or some other kind of noise without any external sound. It's often linked with hearing loss or ear damage. Then we have smell. So you can have anosmia, which is complete loss of smell, can result from viral infections, for example, or head trauma or nasal blockage, and may affect taste as well. And we have the total loss of taste. It's less common than smell disorders, but can occur with nerve damage or medication, side effects from medication. A lot of these actually could result from as side effects from medication, but we're not going to delve into this here. More on that in pharmacology, for example. And then we have touch. So disorders here like neuropathy, which could be caused by damage to our peripheral nerves, often leads to symptoms like tingling or numbness or pain. And it's common in conditions like diabetes. It even has a name. We call it diabetic neuropathy. Then we have chronic pain syndromes such as complex regional pain syndrome, CRPS, where even light touch may cause severe pain. We have something called tactile hypersensitivity, which is seen in some neurological or developmental disorders, like on the autism spectrum, where normal touch sensations feel overwhelming. So in summary then, sensory receptors detect mechanical, chemical, and light stimuli. Each sensory system has a unique pathway to the brain for processing. Integration of sensory inputs allows cohesive perception and interaction with the environment. And that's the end of this lecture. Continue now to chapter 8.